All right, so we are going to get into our next lecture, which today we're going to be able to describe and explain how racism became a tool for the elite in the colonial era. So we're just getting into this early colonial period in North America before, North America became, or before it became the United States. We're in the early 1600s. So looking at your notes, we're going to talk about when the first slaves arrived. So that was in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. And the first 20 slaves arrived on an English slave trading ship. And this was like the very first, as we mentioned, slaves to actually arrive in North America. And as we made the argument and described in our last class meeting, we talked about how those first slaves essentially laid the foundation for the United States, and they deserve that acknowledgement. But moving on, by 1619, there was a quick development of slavery, and that was for two main reasons. The first being that the settlers, they were desperate for food because they were desperate for food because they were starving. And so they were desperate to have labor to grow enough food to be able to survive. So they needed that labor to help grow food because they were they were failures at it. And they also needed labor to help grow tobacco to export for money. So they needed to make some money. They needed to, justify being there. So they needed that labor to help them grow the tobacco. So instead of doing it themselves, they got slaves. And so Edmund Morgan, he was a famous historian. He had a belief about this change in the settlers with their views towards not only Native Americans, but slaves as well. So the settlers started to really have a different view of Native Americans and slaves. So originally it was there was definitely a sense of, superiority, but they did get along at first. But the settlers quickly learned that they could not enslave Native Americans because they were not only outnumbered by the Native Americans, but the natives refused to be enslaved on their own lands. Kind of crazy concept, right? But the white servants also couldn't be enslaved because there was not enough of them, and they were free to leave once they had served their allotted time on their their 5 to 7 years and agreed to be able to be brought to the New World. So the settlers couldn't enslave the natives because they kept fighting back. They couldn't enslave the white indentured servants because there was only a certain amount of time that they could be enslaved. And so because most settlers were merchants, they weren't skilled at labor, so they resented the native skills at farming. So not only could they not enslave anybody, they're sitting there going, well, dang, we pretty much suck at farming as well. So, they're elites, so they don't know how to get their hands dirty, essentially. And then they saw their own people were deserting them to join the natives, so that made them even more eager to kill the natives and use the slaves for labor. And so they had to do something. So we get to the beginning of the slave trade. So they decide that they need to move on to African slaves, which we'll get to why in a minute. But the Portuguese were actually the first to arrive in Africa to get slaves in the mid 1400s. So about 50 years before Columbus, the Portuguese first arrived in Africa and started enslaving the Africans and setting up colonies on the western coast of Africa to enslave Africans and begin trading for Africans. And this is what started what became known as the Atlantic slave trade. So there's a couple of reasons why the Atlantic slave trade was so successful. The first thing is it was successful because the Africans were kind of helpless in a way. And we're going to explain why, though. See, the natives had been able to resist because they were on their own land. The natives in North America, they were able to resist because, they had kind of the home field advantage. And the whites, they had their own European culture. They were still within their own culture. But Africans, on the other hand, had been torn away from their land and brought to a, new foreign land that they knew no one. They did not know the area. They did not know where they were going. And their culture had been ripped away from them, and they were forced into this foreign situation that they had no choice but to accept. And, so the Africans, they weren't captured due to being inferior people biologically, but, they were mainly outgunned by the Europeans. So it was like it was kind of they were forced into a lose-lose situation. All right, so there's a big difference though between African slaves, so like there was slavery in Africa, and American slavery. So as I mentioned, slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans, but it was very different from American slavery. And so one way is that the Africans, they had rights that slaves brought to America most assuredly did not. And so the American slaves were considered cattle, essentially. Whereas African slaves, they could marry, they could own property, and ultimately they could buy their own food. Or freedom, excuse me, not food. Freedom, which I guess both of them if you think about it. But yes, so they could marry, they could own property, and ultimately buy their own freedom, which I guess would give you food as well. But anyway, so there's a big toll. There's a big, it took a heavy toll, the slave trade on Africa. And so nearly 50 million humans, Africans, were either killed or enslaved over the 400 years of slavery. Nearly 50 million. That is an unimaginable number. And so the Europeans worked to destroy not only the humans, but destroyed the trade and agriculture that harmed the remaining Africans who did not end up being enslaved. So not only did the Europeans, take 50 million people essentially, so that's a huge amount of labor that was taken away from Africa, but they destroyed the systems of trade and the systems of agriculture and farming that would have benefited those Africans that remained. So they ended up destroying them on both ends pretty much. And so many of these effects are still visible today in Africa. So before we move forward, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the color black, the actual color black, like that you see on crayons and stuff. So in many ways, the color black was actually labeled with bad connotations before the start of slavery in the 1600s. So the English dictionary described the color black as dirty, soiled, and sinister. So even before the 1600s, the English dictionary described the color black as being dirty, sinister, and soiled. But why? What decided to make the color black bad? Is there some kind of subliminal reasoning for this happening? And why, think about this, why is white always considered the light or pure? I mean, even look at Star Wars. You don't want to go to the dark side of the Force. Like, why is black always considered bad? That's a good question for us to think about when we come to class next. I want y'all to think about that. Why was black always considered bad even before slavery started? So think about maybe some subliminal reasonings for that. But then I want us to get to the main point of class today, this lesson. We want to talk about how racism was used as a tool for the elite. So, as the colonies grew in America, it became clear that white indentured servants, slaves, and Native Americans had a lot more in common than they had different. This is what we worked on in that group activity the other day. So the slaves, white indentured servants, and Native Americans had a lot more in common than they had different. So they worked alongside each other and many times lived together. And they started to realize that there was a lot more of them than there was rich elite plantation owners. So they started to realize that there was a lot more of them than there was, plantation owners. And the elites realized this and saw this as a threat to their power. And so they started to see that they could use this racism or race as a tool to divide up the people. And they did this by starting to pass laws and giving more privileges to like the lower class whites in order to alienate the slaves from the lower class whites and make them hated, as well as the natives. They just kept moving the natives further and further west and massacring them. And so they saw that they could divide and conquer people in order to maintain their power. Okay, so why exactly did slavery grow? So it's pretty straightforward of why they started to grow. Slavery grew as the numbers and the size of plantations grew. So as the more and more plantations grew, the larger the need for more slaves. And so there was not enough indentured servants arriving to meet the need for labor on plantations, so those in charge moved on to importing slaves. But there was also many forms of resistance among the slaves. It wasn't always, slaves weren't just, docile people. They fought back, they resisted. It may not have always been, with guns and rebellions, but it was in many different ways. And so the most common way to resist enslavement was for slaves to just run away. Many slaves escaped into Native American lands and were able to live in those societies as free people. And then other ways that they would resist was, working slowly, destroying crops, or plotting how to rebel, which we'll get to some rebellions in a second. So the colonies responded by passing numerous laws to prevent large gatherings of slaves and giving out more severe punishments for disobedience. So that was kind of the colonist way of putting down rebellions. They were trying to prevent it before it would happen. But the first slave rebellion in North America that we're going to talk about took place in New York in 1712. So it took place in New York in 1712, and note that this was not a southern colony. This was in the north. And in New York, actually, the slave population was 10% of the population, so that was the largest percentage of slaves anywhere in the colonies. Unfortunately, though, the slaves were defeated by the colonists, and their punishment was used as an example to other slaves of the consequences of rebellion. So many of the slaves that rebelled were killed and tortured as a way to kind of give a sign of what was to happen if other slaves rebelled, to try to, prevent future rebellions. But then we get to the most well-known rebellion pre-Nat Turner. And this was called the Stono Rebellion. This was the first major rebellion. So it took place in South Carolina in 1739. And so around 20 slaves overthrew their master and took over a warehouse that stored weapons. And soon there was over 100 slaves. So they started marching throughout the county in southern South Carolina. And they kept gathering more and more slaves until they essentially became a small army. And eventually, they literally were crying or chanting freedom over and over again. They saw this as their way of forming, taking charge and getting liberty and freedom. But eventually they were defeated by the colonists, but this laid the seeds for future slave rebellions. So slaves saw that they had a way to gain freedom and that they had the means and ability to do it. But colonists always, as we're seeing, respond in harsh, preventative ways. And so the colonists responded by passing very harsh slave codes. So the last thing we're going to talk about today is the slave codes. These colonists viewed their hold on power as being threatened by the rebellion of slaves. So the colonists saw that, wow, the slaves aren't happy being enslaved. It's crazy. It's a crazy concept, I know. But the colonists saw that their hold on power was being threatened. And so these slave codes clearly spelled out the difference that was made between indentured servants and slaves in order to create further separation and show just what kind of punishment would happen if they don't stay in line, essentially. So, over the course of this class, we've seen how race has grown into a tool to separate the different groups of people that the elite used to separate the groups of people. And we see that through different slave codes, through different responses to rebellions. And so we're going to see it's going to continue to grow as we move closer to the United States becoming an official nation and breaking away from England. So we're going to see this is going to be a subliminal fight between the elites and the lower classes as we go forward. So make sure to watch any of the attached videos. I have a video attached about the Stono Rebellion, and we will discuss different aspects of these notes in class. So thank you all and have a great day.